today. So, as I mentioned, I'm the chair of Community Energy London. My name's Syed Ahmed. I'm being ably assisted by two project officers, Jess Dunning, if you give us a wave, Jess, and also our latter speaker for the evening as well is Lorraine Haskell. Lorraine, if you want to give us a wave in the box there. Thank you. Okay. Okay, we've got to a decent number and I think the night's moving on. So let's give it maybe another 30 seconds to 6:35 p.m. and then we'll start then. As Jess has just put down in the chat column, we intend to record this evening's event to post it on the Community Energy London website. So if you prefer not to be recorded, do turn off your camera. A few basic ground rules. When we have the speakers speaking, it will be great, A, if you make sure you please mute yourself, and B, also just to reduce distractions when the speaker is speaking, if you could also turn off your camera, unless of course you're the speaker, because that would be slightly unhelpful. So when the speaker is speaking, it'd be grateful if we could all turn off our cameras. If you have any questions, any queries, requests for clarification, pop them in the chat column. I'll be monitoring that as we go along. Also, we will be having a brief Q&A after each of the speakers' session, and then a plenary Q&A at the end of the speakers' contributions of the night. Let's have a look. Okay. Right. I think we'll start since it's 6:35. Good evening, one and all. My name again is Syed Ahmed. I'm the chair of Community Energy London. I'll be telling you a little bit more about Community Energy London very shortly. Okay, and yeah, I'll be telling you a bit more about Community Energy London very shortly, and also the basis for why we're holding this event. We've been holding a whole series of events actually over the last 6 to 7 weeks on a whole number of facets around community energy. And part of the reason we've been doing this is because there's a huge upswell of activity around community energy projects. There's been increasing interest over the last couple of years, but even more so as a consequence of the cost of living crisis, the rising energy prices, which of course not only impacts upon individuals and households, but also on, you know, all kind of organizations from local authority, public sector, private sector, and more wider to other charities, NGOs and other stakeholders who have to operate buildings that require electricity or gas. And we've seen some horrific, you know, kind of stories of 4, 5, 6, 7-fold increases in energy bills over the last 6 to 8 months. Community energy has been growing, but as I say, this has spurred on activity. Jess, Jess, if I forget things, please just remind me as we go through. Next slide, please. So the basis of this event is a research study that Community Energy London has undertaken. We first did a draft of this in summer 2021, and then we held some discussions with various organisations at the time. We then, what did we do? We then contributed to a Greater London Authority event around faith communities and the Green Deal in London in the beginning of this year. And that really spurred on our re-looking at this potential study. And the basis of it is we see lots and lots of synergies between the work that community energy groups do in their neighbourhoods and faith groups do in terms of not only the buildings in which they worship in, but also ancillary buildings, and also talking about energy and carbon issues within their wider faith community. Slide, please. And chaps, I'd be grateful if you could turn off your cameras and just allow the speaker on, if that's okay at the moment, and we'll be bringing people in as we go through. Thanks. The report has kind of 4 sections to it, from what is community energy, looking at the extent of places of worship in London, and again, very strongly want to highlight this is about London, but clearly for those people who are outside of London who've joined us this evening, lots of the issues are relevant to all buildings and places of worship across the country, but we've just taken a focus on London because that's where our groups are, that's where their projects are. The report also includes a number of case studies and sets out a number of recommendations. Next slide, please. And I've got to keep to time. I think I'm already slightly running over time, but I'll try and speed things along. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar, what is community energy? So we've got a slide here of a group in Muswell Hill, one of our members, and 10 Energy. So community energy is effectively a collective of people who come together and they identify, design, develop, and help finance projects that are there to reduce carbon emissions, generate clean energy, and increasingly we're seeing look to alleviate fuel poverty and also provide advice to households in terms of how they can reduce their energy bills. And a key component of community energy as well is keeping that work within the community in terms of the skills, the businesses, the investment and return any benefits that are accrued from community energy projects into the local community. Slide, please. Community energy is growing in London. I won't labour over this slide too much, but just to say we've got well over 150 projects in London at the moment. If you go to Community Energy London's website, you'll see a map that will provide you a guide to where those projects are, what borough they're in, what constituency in, what ward. There are filters to be able to identify it. Many of those projects have been spurred on by the work that we've done with the Mayor of London to provide feasibility and more latterly capital funding for projects through something called the London Community Energy Fund, which I'll return to in a minute or two. Also, we've extended our dialogue from the Mayor to work with a number of councils who also have their own council, local authority-based community energy funds. And as at the end of this year, we've got funds in Camden, Hackney, Haringey, Hounslow, Islington, Lewisham and Southwark. The London Community Energy Fund to date has funded £1.5 million worth of projects. Those projects have brought in around about 3 to 4 times the amount of investment in terms of the funding that they've raised from the local community to get the projects absolutely developed and over the line. Those 8 funds, those community energy funds, if you total up the amount of money, they come to something like £4 million. The funds are growing, we're pleased to say, and that's largely down to the work the groups are doing to actually deliver these projects. So, you know, council officers and councillors can actually see these projects being developed in their area, often quite quickly and with lots and lots of benefits. We're also seeing other actors. London's distribution network operator, UKPN, also has power partner projects, and they will be launching a new phase of that very soon. Next slide, please. 150 odd projects, as I mentioned, have been funded through the London Community Energy Fund. As I mentioned, we've been looking at this crossover between community energy and places of worship for some time now. And we're really pleased to see that there's something like 15 odd projects that have received funding from LSEF over its 5 rounds of operation. There's a list there of a number of them. By and large, they've got feasibility funding because those are the early rounds of LSEF only extended itself to feasibility funding. More latterly, it's now doing capital funding as well for projects. And as you can see, there's a range of different interventions and solutions that these places of worship have installed into their buildings, from retrofitting with insulation, the use of solar, heat pumps, which is really interesting. St. Lawrence is in Catford, has installed a heat pump, which is, I think, going to get some profile from the Mayor of London in the next week or so. And also, you know, improvements to heating systems within those churches. So it's been really encouraging to see that that level of action. I mean, St. John's Church, Waterloo, if any of you went on the climate march 10 days ago, that climate march started at St. John's Church in Waterloo, and that's had a solar installation fitted with support from the Mayor's Community Energy Fund. I should say We've been in dialogue with the GLA over all previous 5 rounds, and we're pleased to say we're hoping that a 6th round of around about £400,000 should be going live in the next week or so. We're just waiting for the final approval document. So please watch our website, communityenergy.london, in the next few days, because hopefully that project will be going live and groups can apply to that. Also, those local community energy funds, the local authority ones, we've seen Islington just launch their 6th round of their fund last week, Hackney the week before last, and there's Southwark to be launched soon, and also Westminster. Next slide, please. Why? Well, there's been huge amounts of interest and action by the faith community around tackling climate change. We saw that significantly in 2021 when the UK hosted COP26, and we've seen that more recently where, you know, a very wide array of faith groups and faith leaders were calling upon global leaders to take urgent action on climate change and setting ambitious targets and programs, especially helping those more vulnerable people and communities. And we're also seeing faith groups, as some of our speakers will talk about shortly, have been doing an increasing amount of work to make their own buildings greener. And so, again, the base of this particular piece of work we're trying to highlight the opportunities for collaboration. We see much crossover between what faith groups are now doing in terms of reducing the carbon impact of their buildings through retrofitting, through the installation of energy efficiency solutions, of solar, PV and heat pumps, as the list prior to this slide showed you. And so we see a number of community energy groups helping develop those projects, but we're barely only scratching the surface. And so we aim to host a series of events over 2023, hopefully building links between places of worship and community energy groups. Today's event will have more of a focus around churches in London, but we'll be extending that through some of the conversations we've been having with the Eco-Seek project, eco-synagogues, and also with the Muslim faith and various other ones as well, in terms of the work they're doing to reduce the environmental impact of their buildings. Jess? We have around about 30 members all around London. I won't go through all those kind of logos there, but all the details are set out on our communityenergy.london web page. And as the right-hand column here on the slide says, how can they help congregations and other faith groups in terms of their projects? Well, they can provide technical support. What is it that you want to actually do to your building to reduce its carbon impact? They can help identify that. Funding routes, how can you access the London Community Energy Fund, borough funds, or any other funding routes? And how do you then go, once you've actually worked out the feasibility of your project, to go more wider in the community to raise funding through the community individually through crowd share offers? And also increasingly, we've been doing many programs through CEL in terms of capacity raising knowledge. We've had recent events around the future direction of solar PV, their cost structures, the types of technologies out there, how groups can actually access PV for their innovative PV solutions for their projects. And also we've done one, we undertook a project last week, an event around smart energy, things like, you know, time of use tariffs, smart meters, the use of storage. That was another event, and we've got one further event, which Jess will pop in the chat column, on decarbonising heat through community energy, which is taking place next week. Next slide. I think I might well stop there, but just to say, we will be publishing this report next Wednesday. We'd hope to finalise it today, but the more conversations we've had, the more material we've had, which has caused us to kind of revise some of the details that we have in here. But today's focus will be largely on churches, and we'll be turning to other buildings and other faith kind of priorities in the new year through at least 2 further events. Part of the reason, obviously, not surprising, we are looking at churches is that there are an awful lot of them in London. There's at least around about 1,700 across lots of different faiths, and there's a breakdown there across, I think, if that's hopefully accurate, across the Diocese of London and the Diocese of Southwark. So there's a huge opportunity there in terms of actually working with congregations in these churches who are already very active in terms of the work that they want to do of reducing their emissions to net zero, which we'll hear about from our speakers shortly. Do you want to take the slides down, please, Jess? And we have 3 speakers this evening, and they are in order of speaking. We have Alan Jones, who is the director of one of SAIL's members, Sustainable Energy 24, SE24, who will be giving an introduction to a number of projects that they have completed. Following Alan, we will have Brian Cuthbertson. Thank you for coming along this evening, Brian. Brian is the Head of Environment and Sustainability at the Diocese of London. And following Brian, we're really delighted, we only were introduced last week, to have Paul Forrest, who's the Head of Buildings and Capital Programme, as the manager there for the other diocese in London, the Southwark Diocese, but for the Southwark Diocese Diocesan, I always have trouble with that word, Southwark Diocesan Board of Education, who've done made great strides over the past year through funding they've secured to help reduce the climate impact of a whole host of their buildings. Finally, we'll have my colleague Lorraine Haskell, who will talk about a series of tools that SAIL have designed over the last 6 months, which we hope could be really helpful in providing resources to groups to actually move ahead with their projects. If you have any questions, as I said, put them in the chat column, or I'll open up shortly, but I'll turn to our first speaker, Alan Jones of SE24, to talk about community energy in action on an actual site that has been developed. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Syed, and good evening, everyone. So I'm Alan Jones. I'm a co-founder and director of SE24, short for Sustainable Energy 24 Limited. And as you might guess, our location is in SE24 Herne Hill. I'm also pleased to say tonight my colleague Paul Hallis is attending, so perhaps he could chip in as necessary at the Q&A stage. So just a bit of intro to who we are. We've been going about 8 years now. We are registered as a community benefit society, so we have certain community fund obligations, which I'll say more about shortly. We began back in 2015, largely focused on delivering solar projects, but more recently we've diversified into delivering LED projects in partnership with our neighbouring energy group, Selkate. And lastly, we put our surplus revenue, as many other community groups do, into a fund to help tackle fuel poverty. Next slide, please. Okay, just an overview of what we do, and I guess this model is very similar to many other community energy groups around the capital and indeed around the country. So, Syed, you already mentioned in outline, but in a bit more detail, we develop projects, so we engage with local site owners, churches, schools, and so on. We then carry out or commission feasibility studies and surveys and do the financial modelling, essentially to test whether a project, whether it's solar or LED, will stack up in financial terms. And in legal terms, we now have a suite of legal documents which we use across our project. So we have a standard lease and PPA and a lighting services agreement. And those typically run for 15 years and 10 years respectively on our individual sites. We also raise the funding, and we've been very fortunate in using or utilising funding we've managed to get through the LSEF funding over the past 5 or 6 years. We've also managed to get some funding from the BA Carbon Fund a few years ago for one of the projects, which I'll talk about shortly. And then the balance of the funding we raise through a local community energy share offer. And to date, we've raised something of the order of about £500,000 across the various projects we've delivered. And then we also chip in some of our own resources to top up where necessary. We then commission the installation. We prepare tenders, invite bidders, and then when the project is in the installation phase, we manage those contracts. And then lastly, we don't walk away from a project. Because we have a long-term relationship with the site. We also have a operations and maintenance contract with a contractor firm called Joju, some of you will know. And we carry out live monitoring of the performance of the solar installation. So we know straight away if we have a problem, and then we can go in and sort out any of those problems. So, you know, we have a maintenance program which gives us and the site owners and the investors peace of mind in terms of the funding that they've put into these projects. Next slide, please. And I won't go through all of these, but this is it gives you a taste of the projects we've delivered. So we've delivered 7 solar projects, 3 LED projects, and we've got a pipeline of about 9 feasibility and pre-feasibility LED surveys, which are in process now. And we're hoping that those will turn into a number of viable economic projects, which we can then submit to the next LSEF round, which Syed mentioned, to secure capital funding and develop those accordingly. Next slide, please. I'll kind of focus in now on the particular faith projects that we've developed over the past. So we have essentially cut our teeth on the first 2 projects you can see here. They're very small projects. Back in 2016, Herne Hill Methodist Church Hall and Herne Hill United Church, 2 small 10 kilowatt peak projects. And those were in the good old days of the feed-in tariff. And also we were lucky to get some USEF feasibility funding, which was a kind of forerunner to the LSEF funding. And then in 2019, we delivered a project at Walworth Methodist Church of 25 kilowatts. So they're all fairly small projects, but we just about managed to make them pay on the basis of the feed-in tariff at the time and those grant funding sources. Next slide, please. Just to say a little bit about some of the challenges we found, and I guess we were very much newbies in the game when we took on those early projects. And what we found with those 3 projects, which were all carried out under the auspices of the Methodist Church, they were all related to the Methodist Church. And therefore, we had to navigate our way through the various approval processes of the Methodist Church, which is quite complex. They have various tiers of trustees which you need to get on board and get approval from. One of the snags we found in the very early days back in 2016 was that the central guidance on which the trustees were relying was out of date and ambiguous in terms of issues around planning, the feed-in tariff, and so forth. So that caused us some delays in the approvals processes. We also had to contend, as these were charitable institutions, with commissioning things called Section 119 valuations to demonstrate they provided value for money. And we also, because of I suppose, the elongated process of getting approvals, we did run up some quite high legal costs. And for these 3 projects, we took on board the full responsibility for the legal fees, which may have been a bit of a mistake, particularly if the site is not too worried about delays in the process, but that's a lesson we learned. Looking back on these projects now, with the ending of the feed-in tariff, they probably would be suboptimal in terms of their economics, although perhaps the 25 kilowatt project at Walworth may be just on the cusp of viability with current energy cost levels. Just another issue we found, one of the sites had multiple users, and we had a safeguarding issue whereby the only way we could access the panels was through a room which was being used by a charitable organisation, and in the end we had to provide our own external ladders at our cost to get access to the panels. And then lastly, on this slide, an issue we found is that some of these establishments have not entirely recovered post-COVID in terms of their use. So Walworth Church, for example, had a whole host of multi-agency bodies using it. Not all of them have returned. As a result, their energy consumption has fallen, so that has impacted our income. Next slide, please. So just a few lessons learned then. I've probably said this previously in other presentations, but with these quite complex approval processes, you really do need a project champion on the site side, and ideally at the central, in this case, Diocesan, the central Methodist body that will help drive the projects through those quite complex approval processes. Otherwise, there is a risk of incurring quite big legal fees. As I say, the governance and the legal arrangements can be complex. With other faith bodies, like, for example, the Anglican Church, you need to be aware of the things like faculties and meeting the Chancellor to get approval for these kind of projects. Don't forget Section 119 charity surveys, and also the amount and pattern of site consumption, particularly with some of the smaller church and faith sites, may be on the balance of viability. They're certainly being helped now by the price hikes, and certainly the savings that our earlier projects are making have probably tripled since you know, the energy prices went up. And then lastly, make sure you have plenty of time built into your program with these kinds of projects. They do take longer than you think. And the last slide, please. Just a few points on next steps. as I said, not all of these sites have fully recovered from COVID. Also, many of them have quite outdated facilities, poorly performing boilers. I'm just thinking of the sites we deal with, and there isn't a great deal of funding available through the government, and hence the importance of community projects like the ones we're talking of, where we have the ability to raise funding from the community, separate from government, which can come to the help of these projects. Separately, SE24 is now working with another partner group called Raft to work up some energy efficiency retrofit and carbon heating assessment. I think one of the lessons from this is that sites need advice on what to prioritize. Quite often they need a new boiler, they go to a supplier and they say, you want this kind of boiler, you want this kind of boiler. They don't give you the kind of rounded view of improving insulation, controls, etc. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we put our revenue fund, our surplus revenue, through a community fund. Currently, we're using CAP, Christians Against Poverty, as our partner to invest that funding to vulnerable groups in our local community. And then lastly, I think one of the important messages from this is, you do need to join up with other agencies on climate and fuel poverty issues. So we had earlier this year the pre-COP event, and last week Paul and I were at the Southwark Faith Leaders Conference, where we were able to network with other community groups to kind of understand the sorts of issues they're facing, and and how we can find a role in developing these kinds of projects. I'm going to stop there. So I'm happy in the time available, if there is any, to take any questions.
Thanks, Alan. As always, a really helpful kind of presentation on the work that SE24 are doing. There's one chat comment that I'll bring up, but Paul as well, your colleague Paul Hallis, you mentioned, is here as well. Paul, do you want to say anything for a minute or two to add? And just while Paul's coming on, Mike Smythe, one of our other colleagues at Community Energy London, working for Energy for All, says, if you use a license rather than a lease, I do not think a section 119 valuation is needed, and legal costs are much reduced.
Yeah, we've discussed this with our sites, and the general, well, certainly with schools, they're not, the schools we've dealt with are not happy with licenses. So our last solar project was with an academy, and when we sought approval from the DFE, they were pretty well rejecting licenses. And also, our earlier sense was that a lease would provide us with a bit more security than a license, but I take on board Mike's arguments for a license. It may be something we could consider going forward.
Okay, Paul, just before I bring you in, forgive me, there's just one more question that has been popped in. Helen Mayer has asked, Alan, do you or any of your partners assist with training energy champions in the communities?
SE24 doesn't at the moment. We would probably refer people to our partner Selke, Nadia, Giovanna. I think they've got a pretty good track record. Is anybody here from Selke tonight?
I haven't seen it, so I'll double check.
Yeah, but Selke would probably be able to help on that, or possibly repowering.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks, Alan. Paul, do you want to just add any other insights from the projects that you've been doing?
Well, I just want to add briefly on the last point. So one of the things that we have been doing in SE24 recently is then encouraging, engaging, and mobilising a larger sort of range of volunteers from the community who want to work with us on various projects. And you know, sometimes we can do that directly ourselves, sometimes through partners. So we are providing, you know, training for people who want to get involved in various types of projects, LED lighting or whatever. So it's a kind of developing area, I would say.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing I just want to add is that again, like quite a few community energy groups, we're trying to get into the heating side of things, because you saw from the presentation, we've traditionally focused on electricity, which I think for a lot of faith groups is only half the problem. As Alan says, they're struggling with, you know, often aging heating facilities, energy inefficient buildings. Not every case, but quite a lot of the ones we deal with. So you know, we're trying to react to that need that we find you know, in the community, and especially amongst you know, faith group buildings of various kinds.
Paul, Alan, thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. I mean, do check SE24's website. One of my colleagues will pop in a link to their website and a particular case study for Walworth, which is well worth reading. So we'll pop that in the chat column in a second. There's a question there. So Mike Smithers handily answered one question there. Harun Rashid has said here, we work with a number of mosques and Muslim faith groups. However, many of these are hard to reach with a number of barriers. Yes, Harun, we've been trying to speak to some mosques and masjids and leaders in the last couple of weeks, and it's been a real challenge. So we're extremely keen. I'll drop my email, Harun, in the chat column very shortly. Please do drop me an email. I'm very happy to continue with that conversation. Alan, thank you again. We'll move on to our next speaker here. But just before we do, Jess, could you just bring up the one slide I was mentioning? So just to illustrate the fact that places of worship are failing, not surprisingly, the increased energy prices. Last month, the Church of England announced a new £15 million to help churches with energy bills. So that was just really interesting to see that happen, and the churches reached out to its churches there to help them with increased energy bills. Take that down, Jess. That was just something I came across early today, and was just interesting to see that, you know, the energy bills really are biting. And consequently, we're seeing huge amounts of activity across all sectors at the moment in terms of making interventions within buildings to increase their carbon efficiency. And on that, we're going to now turn to Brian Cuthbertson, Head of Environment and Sustainability at the Diocese of London. The Diocese of London has made a significant inroads to taking on the net zero challenge, and Brian will be talking about that for the next 10 minutes or so. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Syed, for that intro, and thank you for the slide mentioning the aid being given by the Church of England to offset parishes' costs to some degree, and that's being in our diocese divided equally between about 2/3 of our churches and parishes, and that will be of some help. But I'm going to talk today about net zero and about work that we've done so far and hope to do. Before that, though, I'll just mention, I can't remember whether it was Alan or you, Syed, who explained that there were 2 Church of England dioceses in London. Actually, it was more than that, because the boundaries don't correspond to the boundaries of Greater London. So you might have a community group, for example, in Newham or Walthamstow, who would be in the Diocese of Chelmsford. So I can provide more information on that, or the Church of England can, so you know which jurisdiction you're in. And the system is broadly the same for getting permissions, the faculty system, which Alan mentioned. And there's a committee to get advice from called the Diocesan Advisory Committee. exactly how this works may differ a bit between dioceses, cultural differences really, rather than legal differences. So that's something to be aware of. So that's a preamble. I'll talk now about net zero, which I've been asked to do. The Church of England centrally, in February 2020, the Church of England's National Parliament, if you like, called General Synod, decided on a very ambitious target of achieving net zero by 2030. And the Diocese of London, a month later, we were ready for this decision before it came. And in the Diocese of London, a similar decision was taken by our Diocesan Synod, and a plan presented, an outline plan for how to go about that, presented to the Synod at the same time and adopted. Since then, it's needed a lot, still needs a lot of updating. I and others have learned a bit about future-proofing, which is a very difficult thing to do when planning in the long term, even for just a few years, as in this case. So we will be working again soon on updating that strategy. I should say also that our plans to get to net zero by 2030 for our churches and all our other buildings are part of a theme called compassionate communities, but which is a theme within the diocese's 2030 challenge more broadly. And that is an agenda for all of the activities, all the mission, all the things the church does right across the board. But our net zero challenge, our desire to care for God's creation, and that means our whole environmental efforts, especially combating climate change. That is a key part within compassionate communities. So, so the environmental side and the community side are both at the heart of what we're trying to do. Now, what worked so far? What have we done? Well, there's been a very wide effort, and most of our churches are aware of and are participating to one degree or another in the efforts that we're making. We measure churches' energy consumption. This is done nationally by the Church of England through a system called the Energy Footprint Tool, which is won an award from a National Energy Award. And it's pioneered actually in London. And using the measurement system that we had before that and using that system now, up to 2021, our churches have saved 28% in their energy and 35% in their carbon emissions. So we've got about a third of the way towards net zero, which is encouraging, but the more difficult things are in the later stages of this kind of campaign. It's interesting that there's a difference between the savings in energy and in CO2, and you can calculate one from the other as we do. It reflects a shift in the balance. It reflects different savings of gas and electricity, and also a shift in the balance of demand between gas and electricity. And this is something that is going to shift further and needs to, because it's been mentioned, a church's energy falls very heavily on heating, and we need to get away from fossil fuel-based heating, i.e. gas in most cases, occasionally oil, and switch to electricity. And that is a very major task. It also has implications, as Alan will have realised, for the viability of community energy projects. And I'd be interested in going in more detail into the business model of the groups who are finally supporting or will be supporting some of our projects, because an increase in electricity demand, Alan implied that will be of benefit, but it does depend on what terms that energy is offered to the building users. For example, if you offer free electricity generated by solar panels, then that may make it more difficult to be viable, particularly after the feed-in tariff has been replaced by the smart export guarantee. So this is something that needs to be looked at more closely, and I've been trying to think it through in real time as Alan was speaking. It may also be affected by whether you include storage in the solar panel scheme, as one or two of our churches now do. That's to say battery storage, which improves the viability of the project in most cases, because instead of exporting to the grid at a very low rate of return, you're actually saving up the energy to use it at times when the sun isn't shining, in the evenings, for example, particularly in winter. So these are considerations that all need to be taken account of while planning a project. And a number over the years have been completed so far, and I can circulate or I can provide to Syed web links on our website. For example, our page on solar panels, which has a lot of guidance on it, and we also have a list of solar panel projects that we have already, or churches have already undertaken around the diocese, and there are about 40 something so far out of all our buildings, including churches and some houses as well. Moving swiftly on, because time is limited, I know. I'll highlight just one of our solar panel projects, which was pioneered really and developed by Power Up North London, St Anne's Church in Highgate, and that's been quite widely illustrated, and that's been very successful and very prominent. So thank you to Power Up North London, and we'd like to do more. Although that was in the days of the feed-in town, so as I've said, the business model will have changed. I'm aware that Power Up North London does still give grants. What I don't know is how much of a profit can be made to invest in projects, in the other projects in the community. Right now, we're very strongly focused on, as you'd expect, on savings in energy for cost reasons. But if we're saving energy for cost reasons, that also helps to drive down our carbon footprint. So we're very focused on this and on a broad fundraising campaign, both for short-term, small-scale, low-cost improvements, which maybe all that some churches can contemplate in the very stretched financial circumstances they may find themselves in now, but also not forgetting medium-term, larger capex projects, which some churches may still be able to contemplate. And there are several which are in development, both for solar panels and for heat pumps and for other technologies, of which there are a range, like far infrared heating, for example, potentially electrical boilers beginning to look like they might be viable. Heat pumps we're working very hard at. You'll be aware that there are several different kinds of heat pumps, depending on whether they draw heat from the ground or from the air. And if they do draw ground heat from the air, whether that's mediated into the building through a hot water system or air-to-air into a ventilation system. So those are among the various alternatives that we can look at. A little bit about the approval process, which I mentioned earlier, the faculty system, and the Diocesan Advisory Committee, which is also very committed to the aims and objects that we are pursuing. And as well as being the head of environment and sustainability for the diocese broadly, I am also specifically the environment advisor for the Diocesan Advisory Committee. So any project that goes to the DAC for advice prior to getting a faculty will also be presented to me, and whoever is initiating the project, the church or a community group, can come straight to me and I will advise, or can go through the DAC. Either way, what I say will be taken into consideration, so it's very joined up. One thing to bear in mind, which I think I'll close at this point, about the faculty system, is that if any installation such as solar panels does involve a lease, or more likely it would be a license, on the roof of a church or a church hall, you will actually need two faculties. You will need a faculty for the project, and you will also need a faculty for the agreement, the license terms. And it would be easy to trip up on that. So that's just something to bear in mind. And I think that would be true in other dioceses as well, including Southwark. and Chelmsford. So I'll conclude at that point and invite questions, Syed, if you feel there's time for that.
That's excellent, Brian. Really good. And I think one of the things I've seen is just the sheer volume of work that's really gone on in the last 18 months. I think we'd both agree that there's been a real step change in actually the work that's been undertaken by many of your churches. Would you say that's true to say?
Yes, I would. I would. And I've personally been very encouraged by how positive the experience is when talking to churches and stakeholders. And when visiting churches, as I visited one very prominent church this afternoon, who need to replace a failed boiler in time for their Christmas carols. So they are under a lot of pressure, but they are still engaging with me on a conversation about how that can be done in a way which helps the challenge of reaching net zero.
One of the things that I find working day to day with colleagues here from the community energy sector is the level of ambition, the desire to really see some change in their local neighbourhood, especially in buildings and assets that the community use on a regular basis. There's a real kind of sense of, dynamism to get that done. Now, just one thing, Brian, you mentioned a particular church and the work that was undertaken by Power Up North London, PUNL, Punnell, and actually we have two representatives from Punnell here this evening. So if Brian's question about funding, I believe we have Ian Grant and also Tanuja Pandit. Ian, do you want to have a go first? And if not, Tanuja can jump in.
Yeah. We have an annual community energy fund which distributes about 5,000. So it's a rolling open fund, and this year we've done a scout centre and a local school, and last year we did 2 schools. So it is open to anybody. It's 5,000. It's just on application. The church hasn't yet applied, but it's very welcome to. We had a good experience with St Anne's. We had a champion there in the Vicar, and it's one of the first ones we did. So I think everything went really well. The only hold up was the planning application. We had support from local councillor on the planning because of the conservation views from the heath. So I think that was the major obstacle we had to overcome, but we overcame it. And I think because of the fit, it's gone really well. Tanuja, I don't know whether you want to add anything.
It's just the obvious that the economics for churches are always a challenge with solar, because the utilization is much lower than for other buildings like schools and medical practices or other community buildings. I guess you mentioned, Brian, that you use batteries to kind of make better use of the solar rather than just pumping it into the grid. But of course, that also comes with a cost attached to it. And so just sort of trying to think about how we can make the financials work better for churches. And one thought we had, because we have a number of churches approaching us at the moment, actually, in Camden and also some in Islington. And it would be fantastic if we could, join up some of these churches and do a sort of group raise of some kind to, get them all up to a standard, rather than having to go site by site, which can be quite piecemeal and take quite a long time. I don't know if you have a view on that.
All right. First thing to say is that the energy usage in a church, in London particularly, may be more than you think, because quite a few do have 24/7 usage for a whole variety of community uses. And therefore, and a lot of evening activities, sometimes even, there might be a homeless person shelter which needs a amount of energy during the night, and therefore battery storage is potentially very viable in many cases. And of course, yes, it does cost more. So someone needs to do the numbers and see whether it stacks up, and it won't in all cases. What were your second or third questions? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it's fantastic. If there's a greater use and we can make it work better with the battery, that's all good news. I guess the question was really about, can we combine, take a number of churches forward together in one go, and what would it take? What sort of support could we expect to, just to get the legals over the line? And, you mentioned this, I wasn't quite sure of the term, that you said faculty for the project and faculty for the license. But I mean, there's basically legals that we need to go through. Yes. And what support can we expect? And it would be really helpful if we can have some of that support to push projects over the line.
We've talked about, among ourselves, we've talked about grouping projects between churches and some clustering them, and that's something we would like to do. Though it needs to be borne in mind that every church is an individual organisation and charity, and it's its own master, and there is a degree of herding cats about this. But if you have several churches at the same time in the same diocese who are talking to you, then it makes sense to include them in a single conversation. You won't be able to include them in a single faculty application. There will have to be one from each church and one site notice too, because there is this public site notice that needs to go up, and very strict rules about when it goes up and when it comes down and things like that. And they will be considered individually after it's been through the Diocesan Advisory Committee, and then it goes to the Chancellor of the Diocese, the Chief Legal Officer, and he will consider them all individually. The application to the Chancellor is called a petition, and he will consider them one by one. So there may not be huge economies of scale, but it nevertheless administratively might be something I
think you've highlighted some really relevant kind of issues there, Brian, which is very helpful. I think one of the things that we might want to do and take this offline maybe in the new year is just that point of your organisation signposting at least community energy, because we're finding out that some churches are familiar with community energy groups, many are not. So actually, and we have routes to actually talk about this, but I've got a feeling you'd have slightly more effective routes to be able to do that. But Brian, if you wouldn't mind, we're running slightly over time. First of all, thank you for that contribution. That was really, really super helpful. And again, as I mentioned and you've indicated, there's real major strides being taken by the church over the last 12 to 18 months. And it's something that we're very aware of and want to kind of work in tandem with those churches to make sure that we can accelerate the deployment of projects in London. Tanuja, Ian, thank you as well for your contributions. I think we're running slightly over time, and so we'll turn immediately to our next speaker, Paul Forrest. Paul, over to you.
Hi there, thank you, and hopefully you can hear me okay.
Perfect.
Great. Right, yes, well, thank you for the invite tonight. So I'm Paul Forrest. I'm the Buildings and Capital Programmes Manager for Southwark Diocese, so that's south of the river. And my background is very much that of a non-specialist, so I'm not a surveyor, I'm not an M&E specialist, I'm not an engineer or electrician by background. I was more of a project manager. So to use that awful phrase, I have been on a bit of a journey, and I've been asked to just sort of talk to you about that journey and some of the lessons that I've learned, which I'm very happy to do. So Jess, if you could just do the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of my starting points was this very helpful graphic, which essentially shows you, and I'm sure because you've got a lot of experts in the room, you may be familiar with this sort of inverted energy triangle, which essentially is, I find very helpful because it sort of shows you in a very neat form how you should prioritise the decarbonisation of a building. And it should really start with behaviour change, with better heating and lighting, smarter heating and lighting, those sorts of things. If you're building a new building, you build a passive building, so you have very low need for heat inputs in the first place, etc., etc. And I suppose one of my key messages tonight would be just about how important the fabric of a building is, and how a fabric-first approach, especially if you're refitting an older church building, for example, is so key. what we find with schools is that, you know, our schools, we've got a range of different types of schools, but with a typical Victorian school, it will have accreted many, many adaptations over the years. And those original Victorian architects and engineers and builders were very, very clever people. And they designed their buildings very cleverly for use of coal and to maximize use of sunlight. And they had ventilation strategies and also all those sorts of things. Quite brilliant. And over time, those things are covered up by new adaptations. Perhaps someone comes along, a builder or a designer doesn't really understand how the building worked, and they add something, and it sort of undermines the original purpose of the building. And one of the things I think you need to do is really think about, perhaps consider getting a heat decarbonisation plan done by an expert. And I heard someone mention Retrofit Action for Tomorrow. They're an organisation we're working with as well. They're very good, and there are other organisations out there with architectural expertise that can help you understand how your building sort of works and how best to retrofit it. Because a lot of buildings will have dormant dry rot in the timbers. And one of the things you don't want to do is cocoon a building. I mean, that's one of the first things you want to do is think about cocooning your building so you don't have to have those heat inputs. But you also need to be very, very mindful of moisture control. And, you know, if dry rot spores get to certain levels of moisture, they will then activate. And before you know it, your building will be full of dry rot. And I know from experience how expensive and disrupted it is to have to deal with something like that. So my sort of first message, I suppose, is be fabric first and be very mindful of the building you're retrofitting. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I put some. So yes, thank you. Yeah, that last bit with the arrows was just saying where our essentially where our project I'm talking about today actually sort of areas that it tackled. But we can come back to that. So just a bit more background. So at the moment we are in Southwark, we're 104 schools. And in 2020, when we applied for public sector decarbonisation scheme funding in round one, so PSDS round one, we had 84 voluntary aided schools, 19 academies, 1 foundation. And most of those schools are small primaries. And the detail you can see there is a typical school of ours. Beautiful buildings, but very challenging, and all different types really that we've got. And as I say, those accretion of adaptations are a continuing challenge for us. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the PSDS programme, I think, so if I remember correctly, it was launched during lockdown or just before. It was a very, very tight turnaround to get a grant bid in. I just happened to be, through dumb luck really, in a good position because I'd previously signed up for the Mayor for London's refit scheme, and I had been working with their low energy consultancy through that scheme called Asset Plus. They became our bid partner. And our bid was quite opportunistic because once we'd analysed the bid criteria, we realised that it was a very mechanically led, M&E led scheme. And so the solutions that were come up with that were done across 59 schools in the end were very M&E led. So it was a little bit of a case of putting the cart before the horse, I would say. But nevertheless, you know, obviously a good thing when a funding opportunity comes up like this, you sort of want to grab it with 2 hands. Thanks. Next slide, please. So what we did is, or our partners did, was basically did a desktop survey of a number of our schools. Energy data was collected, boiler age data was collected, and originally we had 66 schools in the bid. That was whittled down in the end to 59 for various reasons. And in the end, we submitted for those. I think we submitted for 60 schools, and essentially the bid was a mixture of air source heat pumps in a hybrid configuration with existing gas boilers. And one of our key performance indicators, one thing I was very clear about, is that the projects had to be revenue cost neutral for schools, just because school budgets are so tight. As part of the scheme, some countermeasures were included for each school, and those were mainly LED lighting upgrades, because most of our schools had a very, very poor mix of old types of lighting. And in about 10 schools' cases, solar panels were added. So obviously heat pumps, any kind of heat pump uses electricity. So the countermeasure was a LED lighting configuration. Most schools got at least 100 new LED lights. Some schools got 200, 250, and solar panels to essentially reduce their electricity costs because and their gas costs, because the heat pumps were obviously using additional electricity throughout the winter. So we submitted a bid. It was a very ambitious bid. We submitted a bid for 26 million. That was roughly split half and half between M&E improvements and about 13 million for fabric improvements. So we did try and put the cart and the horse in the bid, as it were. In the end, I mean, we were hugely grateful to Bays and Salix for the money. We got about 13 million for M&E improvements, and about 500,000 out of the 13 million that we asked for, 500,000 for fabric improvements. So not so good on that front, hence the position we find ourselves in now, but still good. Thanks. Next slide, please. So I don't know how much you know about heat pumps, but there are lots of different types. The type we have are air to water heat pumps. So what these do is the heat pumps essentially heat water in the single pipework systems of our schools. So they're installed at the end of the pipework. So before water goes back into the boiler, it is heated up by an electric heat pump, and then is then fed into the boiler, which will then use a little bit of gas to get that water up to the operating temperature of that particular boiler system. And as you probably do know already, these are all sorts of air heat pumps are very efficient. The air to water kind, using a sort of a measure which I don't fully understand, but the seasonal coefficient of performance, the SCOP, I think it's called, air to water heat pumps have a SCOP of 3 to 3.5. So what that means in layman's terms is that for every kilowatt of energy input of electricity there is, the pump will produce 3 to 3.5 kilowatts of heat output. So they are very, very efficient. Excuse me. So good from that point of view. Other pros, it's a well-established technology now, and they're fairly inexpensive to service on a year-to-year basis. In terms of cons, they have a fairly short lifespan, 10 to 12 years, I believe. They are often quite large, they're very heavy, and they generate noise. So sometimes an acoustic cage is needed in certain scenarios, and obviously where you put your heat pump is quite important for lots of reasons, which I'll come on to. So next slide, please, Jess. So yeah, so just really you know, this is an example. This is, I think, Trinity St Mary's in Wandsworth. This is a very large heat pump. I think that's the size of a car or a small shed. We had playground space, fortunately, to put that monster, but it is something to really think about. You know, one of the things behind this scheme is that we are moving away from gas, which, as we probably all know, is a greenhouse emitter. From you know, you create CO2 when you burn the gas, and currently when the gas is extracted, it produces methane, which is a really, really potent greenhouse gas. So that's part of the reason why this project has done quite a lot to reduce our carbon footprint, because we are really reducing our gas use. So what I would say about them is they really aren't suitable for mounting on roofs and walls without doing a structural survey first. I mean, you can do, but we did have some real issues in a number of schools, and we've had to re-site some heat pumps as a result of the speed at which work was done. We made a few mistakes there. And from a planning point of view, and Brian has already talked more expertly than I can about faculties, but in a similar way, you need planning permission for a faculty for a church building. You might need planning permission for a school, a heat pump in a school scenario, and you do have to think about neighbours' boundaries and the noise that the heat pump will produce, which is continuous. It's a low hum, but it could be very annoying if you've got a neighbour's bedroom window directly below your heat pump. And you also need to think about the aesthetics of where you put a heat pump, because they're not pretty. Next slide. So just to give you some idea of outcomes. So we've managed to reduce gas use across the 59 sites by 38%, saving 5 million kilowatt hours of gas. Excuse me. And with the countermeasures in aggregate across those sites, we've saved about, I think it's about 1 million kilowatts of electricity through these LED lighting and solar panel installations. And then the insulation improvements, another 500,000 kilowatts in energy savings. That sounds really impressive. Schools are very, very energy hungry types of buildings, so it's perhaps not as impressive as it might look. And you have to also bear in mind that in terms of the heat pumps themselves, in aggregate, they are now using 8.2 million kilowatts of extra electricity to power the new pumps. So while we have reduced our CO2 use, because we haven't got the fabric first approach going yet, we are using a lot more electricity than we were before. So there's a lot more to do. Next slide, please.
Paul, you've got 2 minutes if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, sorry, yeah. So it's sort of last points really. So key challenges, district network operator approval. So heat pumps, because they're very large installations and draw a lot of power, you will in London need UK Power Networks approval. There is a approval process that you need to follow. And what we found in most schools is most installations didn't require any upgrade works, but 4 did. And for those 4 schools, the costs were high. It was 600,000 in total to do the network infrastructure upgrades. And these were for schools that were in the sort of outer reaches of London, interestingly. So all our inner London sites had got given no works letters by UK Power Networks. So it's something to bear in mind. And as Brian has always mentioned about the faculty process and planning process I've talked about already. But also, of course, conservation areas and local and national listing of your buildings is another factor to consider. Okay, next slide, please. I think hopefully this is the last one. So key learning, I would say, is just, first of all, understand and monitor your energy use. The energy footprint tool that people have mentioned before is a fabulous place to start. Heat decarb plans and taking a fabric first approach and understanding the idiosyncrasies of your building is really key. Low-hanging fruit, insulation, lagging of pipe work and LED relamping are really good. And then just think about those planning DNO faculty issues. And I think, is that my last slide? Yes, I think that was my last slide.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Paul. I mean, just a really impressive initiative undertaken there, Paul. All power to your elbow in terms of making that application, getting the money in. We've had a couple of comments there about the heat pumps, I think, and the noise. So when you say the noise, how much of an issue was it actually, Paul?
For most schools, not a huge issue, but we did have one or two sites where it's really tight, and you know, the options to put the heat pump were quite limited. So one or two of them have required planning permission, and that's included having to undertake acoustic surveys for those sites. So it's not a huge expense. Well, I say not huge, but it's a couple of £1,000 to get those surveys done. But it's one of those things. It's all in the planning and the preparation with anything like this, because we just didn't have that luxury. We sort of had to kind of deal with these issues as we went along, which isn't always good.
Okay. Well, listen, if you can turn your camera off but hang fire, we'll bring you back in the plenary session very shortly. Before we do that, I'll turn to our last speaker, Lorraine Haskell, who's just going to outline some major work that CEL has been undertaking in hopefully providing some useful tools to groups, both community energy groups and wider community groups. Lorraine, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Lorraine, so I'm a project officer for Community Energy London. We have a load of resources for groups looking to deliver projects, so I just wanted to highlight them. First off, we have on the resources page, and we'll put some links in the chat, we have a 10-step guide for setting up a community energy group. We then have 5 guides for delivering various projects on various technologies, including solar PV, LEDs, air source heat pumps, delivering an energy advice project, and on electric vehicle charging points. These guides run through the various stages of delivering a project in order, and they give lots of really good advice and tips on delivering various projects. And some of those projects also include tips on churches, delivering projects on churches. So hopefully really relevant to this workshop. The other thing we have is a monitoring and evaluation toolbox. So groups, after they've delivered a project, they can measure the success of the project, which might be really vital if they have a funding provider, that they can feed back how successful that project went, prove that the money was spent on delivering a successful project. So we have those all on the website. We also are running at the moment a fuel poverty and energy advice project. So for groups looking to deliver energy advice projects to anyone really, it doesn't have to be in fuel poverty. We have a dedicated page on the CEL website. Lots of resources there, lots of really useful resources. And we've also been running a series of workshops, the last of which is on Friday and is on the cost of living, energy costs and support for clients. So that's on Friday at 12:30 and can be signed up to for free on Eventbrite. And again, I'll put a link to that in the chat. We just a point there, we are about to release some new versions of the guidance onto the website. Next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. So the other big thing to mention is that we have just launched our community energy peer monitoring program. So we just launched it this week, which is really exciting. And this is for community energy groups in London, delivering a project in London. Doesn't matter what the project is, as long as it's a community energy project, looking to get some advice from one of our expert mentors. So why a group might sign up to have a session with a mentor. A mentor can help you get your project off the ground with support on issues such as business finance, the various technologies, or an energy advice delivery, depending on what your project is. You can benefit from the skills, the expertise, the enthusiasm of our experienced mentors. So you're not reinventing the wheel, you're learning from their experiences, things that they've already been through, getting lots of great advice. And the sessions are free, so why would you not do it? We're also running it in line with the LSEF energy, the London Community Energy Fund, LSEF 6. So if you're bidding for funding through LSEF 6, you might also want to get a session with a mentor to help you be able to deliver and develop that project. So these are for groups who are delivering or developing a project, and you might have got stuck on a certain point, or you just need to have some advice, and our mentors can help you do that. Next slide, Jess, please. So final slide. These are all our awesome mentors. They are all part of community energy groups. They have loads of experience. They've done this before, as I said, so we're not reinventing the wheel. They can give you lots of great advice. So to apply for a session, you just need to go onto our website. Again, I'll put a link in the chat. You need to fill out an application form, and we will then review it at Community Energy London, and we will allocate a mentor to groups, and they will arrange the session directly with you. Sessions are for 3.5 hours, and this is running till the end of January. So hopefully we're going to get lots of applications in.
Thanks, Lorraine. So we're really proud that we've got this new peer mentoring scheme on, which is trying to accelerate the deployment of projects in London. As Lorraine said, it's we've got experts there on a whole bunch of technologies, project management, finance, and many other things in between. Profiles of those mentors are on the page as Lorraine set out. And so, yeah, if you're a group and you'd like to have that additional kind of support to identify your project, especially as we hopefully anticipate future funding from the Mayor of London coming through, do please consider it. If we could have Brian and Paul and Alan back again, just for the last 5 minutes, we'll try and be efficient and quick on this, and we'll just see if we can open up any final last questions. There's one question from Mike Smythe for you, Brian. Brian, I thought the faculty process acted in the place of planning consent and listed building consent for Anglican churches. Is it one or the other, I think that's saying, but Mike might correct me if I'm wrong. But Brian, do you want to have a go at that, please?
Yes, the faculty process displaces the listed building consent for churches in use as places of worship. It doesn't displace planning permission. Planning permission is still required for anything basically that affects the outside appearance of a building and on the same terms as any other building. Now, some things are permitted development. At some churches, most houses will be, and probably a lot of schools, will be permitted development because they are unlisted. Even then, it's a good idea to get from the council a thing called a certificate of lawful development, because there is an element of discretion about the terms on which exemption applies. Almost all, I think, listed buildings will require planning permission anyway for anything happening outside. And in conservation areas, in the case of solar panels, if it's a conservation area, you will need permission if it faces the highway. Otherwise, probably not. But really, in honesty, you are better to get either a planning permission or a certificate of lawful development. It ought to be easier, but you really do need one or the other.
And just on that point around planning, Brian,
yes.
With all the challenges that you've set out in the chat column and also in terms of your talk earlier on, the points you raised, of the, I think, 400 or 500 churches in your patch, I believe that's the approximate number, please correct me if I'm wrong. Do you have a feeling for how many of those churches will really actively look to kind of take on best practice from some of the more, kind of like pathfinding projects that you've talked about?
Well, there've been 20-something that have installed solar panels so far, a smaller number of heat pumps. We're going to be more proactive about this. Normally in the past, we have responded to proposals by parishes which have come up from the grassroots. We are now beginning to be more proactive and to scope those churches that have potential in particular areas For example, if they have large south-facing roofs without obvious obstructions, without too much tree cover. So we can scope them, and we can then reach out to the church concerned and see if they're interested. And some will be, and some no doubt won't. And it is a challenge process. No question. And getting planning permission is not easy, and one sometimes has to go through 2 or 3 iterations in order to satisfy the council that it is visually acceptable. So it's not that easy, but a number of churches have done it already, and we are sure there will be many more who will do so in the future.
Perfect, Brian. Paul, just to you, I mean, you helpfully highlighted to me when we spoke prior to this meeting that, of course, you're in the education element of the Diocese of Southwark, and you have colleagues who effectively undertake Brian's job elsewhere. So I'm just wondering, to what extent, oh, there's a poll coming up, hold on a second. To what extent do Brian's equivalent in the Diocese of Southwark and Brian, maybe I should be asking Brian, but if you could give some insight first, actually kind of share best practice and knowledge across the 2 dioceses?
Well, sorry.
Yeah, Paul, you go first, and Brian, you come back.
Yeah.
I would say, if in all honesty, I'm a very small team. I just don't have time. In terms of my link up with my colleagues in Southwark Diocese on the church side, a colleague of mine actually is the sort of link man. So there's regular conversations, but it's probably I'm missing a trick actually in terms of sort of tapping into the expertise that might be available to me if I were to but ask.
Brian?
Yes, well, we do talk to each other and have done for many years. We have good conversation with the Secretary of the Diocesan Advisory Group, Jack Edwards, in Southwark, as well as our own DOC staff, and also with other staff in Southwark. And we've done something jointly. For example, we've run a joint carbon literacy programme, and there's a lot of potential for future cooperation.
I think the behaviour change element is really powerful. Sorry, Paul, you were going to say something there?
Yeah, sorry, just one other thing, actually. I should also mention briefly, there is the Church of England Building Officers Group, and our colleague Robin, who manages that, has set up a working party. So my counterparts across dioceses are working very closely and have a working party on meeting that 2030 target. And I'm sure there's probably quite a lot of feedback to colleagues in the church side of things from
also,
my counterparts.
One more thing, there is a lively discussion going on all the time between diocesan and environment officers, of whom I'm one, even though I have a fancy title, DEOs all over the country, and also energy advisors and engineers who are advising diocesan advisory committees and advising dioceses have a Google group, and we talk to each other all the time.
Well, it's great to see this kind of energetic discussion. Alan, come back, because I was just going to give you the last word, if that's okay. It's great to see this energetic discussion going on, as Brian and Paul are indicating. Alan, I'll give the last word to you. In terms of the projects that you've undertaken, what do you think would really unlock that real ability for church congregations, church organisations and community energy groups to work together in a more cohesive manner? What would really unlock it for you?
I think some central advice from the diocesan bodies to act as kind of brokers between the individual churches and the community energy sector. Perhaps publish some case studies that have worked, and also make sure that the community energy sector is sort of in the consciousness of of the various churches, and gets some sort of liaison. If we could have some sort of representation with the diocesan officers at the centre, that would be very helpful.
Okay, we'll be really looking to try and take that forward in the new year. And on that basis, as I mentioned, we're going to be this will be the first in a series of events we'll hopefully be doing with faith groups over 2023. In order to do that effectively, colleagues have put together a quick poll, and I realise we're running over time, but I promise this won't take more than a minute. Lorraine, launch the poll.
The poll has been launched.
The poll has been launched. Why can't I see it? So can people see the poll? Hopefully they can.
Yeah, we've had lots of great participants.
Oh, great. Okay, just me being hopeless. Okay, so if you, for whatever reason, you can't see the poll or anything, and you'd like to find out more about Community Energy London, either pop to our website, communityenergy.london, jot your details or organisations down in the next minute in the chat column, and we'll harvest that information and get back to you. I think that only leaves me, I'm looking to Jess hopefully to prompt me in case I've forgotten anything. If you're interested in more about Community Energy London and membership, it costs you, our secretary who's on the Zoom at the moment, Sydney Charles, would advise you that it costs the princely sum of £1 to become a member of CEL. That will allow you access to a vast amount of documents, resources, connections into various other groups, attendance at monthly meetings, which we've been holding for nearly 5 years on the last Thursday of every month in the evening from 6 to 8 p.m. And also, as Lorraine's pointed out, our new peer mentoring program, free of charge experts at your beck and call. I mean, what could be better than that? It only leads me to say, Brian, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to continuing a very active conversation with you in the new year. Paul, it's been a real pleasure to meet you, and once again, huge success in terms of your securing that funding from government, a major victory. Alan, Paul, and other Community Energy colleagues on the call this evening, thank you very much for all your help. And as I say, we'll post the details of this event on our website, along with the forthcoming events, and we may well turn back to you, Brian and Paul, as we develop these kind of projects in the new year. Until then, I just want to thank you again to all our speakers, all our other contributors on the night in the chat column, and by your questions, and we look forward to see you in 2023. I should just say we've got a couple of other events about decarbonising heat next week, a fuel poverty event on Friday, and our monthly meeting on the 1st of December. And then on the 7th of December as well, we've got one final event of the year, looking at that £4 million of community energy funds that we've helped develop with local authorities, many more hopefully of those to come. So a very active series of events. Please do come along, contribute, and look forward to seeing you then. 5 minutes overdue, apologies all, but look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye then. Cheers.